Mental health professionals of Reddit, what is the most disturbing case you have personally encountered? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I worked in a residential setting for people with traumatic brain injuries when I was 17. I took a 34-year-old male to the grocery store. Before getting out of the car, he grabbed my arm and told me that if I don't have sex with him, he would kill himself. I told him that I would not be having sex with him and that I would be contacting my supervisor. As I called her, he got out of the car and began running towards the freeway. I got out and ran after him, telling her briefly what happened and asking for help. The response? "I'm grocery shopping, figure it out." I talked him off the ledge, but it took 45 minutes. I used every verbal de-escalation technique I knew. She showed up nearly an hour and a half after I called, kids in tow. 40-year-old male seemingly gave up on life, quit his job, became homeless, and started sleeping about 20 hours a day. Family insisted he seek help. Turns out he got really good at lucid dreaming and found his dream world better than the real world. Would wake up to do basic life things like eat and go to the bathroom, then live 1,000 years as a king in his dreams. He was perfectly sane, and it made me question everything. Not exactly mental health, but a paramedic. I saw some pretty rough stuff like suicides, etc., and most of the time we get there fast enough to talk them out of doing it. Once we got called to a case of a person threatening to kill himself by train. There was an immediate shutdown of the rail requested, but they refused to step off the tracks. As he asked to see his wife and kids, they got there pretty fast. He hugged his children on the tracks, pulled a gun, and ended it. Those kids probably will stay traumatized forever. Selfish. Male, 35 years old with severe bipolar disorder. When he was in a manic state, he would stop taking all his medications and consume about 15,000 calories per day, leading to an astronomical levels of fat in his blood. At 35, he was in heart failure after 3 myocardial infarctions, and his pancreas was toast after 20-plus episodes of pancreatitis. When I talked to him, he was in a neutral state, and told me he was trying so hard, but there was nothing he could do. When the manic state came, he felt like the king of the world that had no use for medications and could eat everything. I work with severe trauma cases, so I've seen it all. I have a client who is intellectually disabled, and when he was a kid, his mother would chain him to a tree out back and let people come over and pay her to do whatever they wanted to him. DCF found him malnourished, bleeding from the anus with a traumatic brain injury from the abuse. Because of his injury, he really doesn't remember the abuse. He still calls his mother and speaks nicely of her. I work exclusively with sex offenders, some of whom are pedophiles by diagnosis. My line of work puts me face to face with some of the worst that humanity has to offer, and part of my job is to listen to detailed descriptions of what happened before, during, and after their offenses. The offenses against infants can be pretty tough to sit and listen to. I had a family with 9 kids where both parents sexually abused all of their kids. We took in one kid when both parents were arrested and put into jail. Super sweet guy, but had absolutely no sexual moral compass. He misinterpreted body language and see that as a green light to initiate sex. He did not understand a no, because saying no had never stopped anything sexual in his childhood either. Please let that last sentence sink in. Anyway, Dad stays in jail since there's footage of him fucking his 1-year-old baby. Mother gives birth in jail and then gets released because no evidence against her. She gets back 4 of the kids, including the newborn, and decides to visit her son who lives with us, who, we gathered by this time, she had pretty much sexually abused from his birth. We absolutely love this guy, but he's a broken husk because of what she did. We can't leave him alone because he'll rape fellow patients, not out of malice. Just doing, he does not understand how sex works in any way. Mother visits, and she's the piece of shit you'd imagine. The newborn gets 0 attention from her the entire time she's with us. The kid is 6 months old and something, and you already see he's not quite right. He screams nonstop while he's there. Can you imagine how we, care workers for the other son, are feeling? We loathe this woman. We don't even want to let her in, but we're professionals and we receive them. We're glad when she leaves. A day later, I, social worker, get a phone call. She feels mistreated. We weren't nice to her. She's pissed. I just had to sit there and take it and blurt out my standard, "Well, it must not be what it looks like. We were busy," sort of bullshit sentences when I just wanted to shout out, "You messed up all 9 of your kids and probably molested most of them as babies. How do you think we should treat you, bitch?" I'm a man who has only cried like 5 times since my teens. I had myself a nice little cry when I put down that phone. Still gets to me, man. Worked in inpatient psych, and we had a kid 12 years old who had schizophrenia and autism. He was nonverbal. His mom had forgotten to refill his psych meds for 2 weeks, and the kid had a psychotic break. From what we could tell, he had auditory, visual, and tactile hallucinations. A prominent one was seeing a certain animal that was a death omen in his culture. It had been so hard to get this kid stable because of the communication difficulties, and his mom screwed it up. There was the daily challenge of, is he ramming his head on the wall and screaming because of the hallucinations, or is he overstimulated? Another patient, 20-year-old, had severe depression. She had been in and out of a different facility throughout her childhood and adolescence, and it had recently been revealed that staff at that facility repeatedly raped her every visit. She couldn't even make eye contact with us. We had to do room checks, which entailed stepping just inside the doorway and making sure the patients were okay. We didn't think. When I stepped in her room, she went from sitting on her bed, we didn't knock in case the patients were sleeping, to flinging herself into a corner in a ball. We had to completely change our policies with her. All doctor appointments were in a room with security cameras, and we had to show them to her and show her the monitors before she'd step in the room with a female doctor. There was also the case where an 11-year-old girl married her father and was pregnant with his kid. She was very angry that she wasn't allowed to talk to her husband, and she would not remove her wedding ring. I am not a mental health professional, just an old paramedic. Saddest I saw was a very healthy and reportedly well-adjusted 22-year-old female. She was a bridesmaid at a wedding. She was attending with her husband or boyfriend. She kissed another guy. Why? And suddenly had some kind of break with reality. She just started talking about really random things and was unable to really carry on a conversation. Her significant other brought her to the ER thinking stroke or diabetes. After being evaluated medically and finding nothing, the mental health counselor on call was brought in. He believed she had developed schizophrenia and had suddenly manifested itself. He stated, "Her family is facing a very long and difficult road with her. She'll need very long-term treatment." It was incredibly sad to see this young woman with such promise to be dealt this hand. ER nurse. See plenty of psych. Patients come in from jail, sick. Old fella, lethargic. Keeps whispering something, motioning with his hands in the air, licking his lips, can't quite hear. After tests and stuff have to be put second line as patient is sick. Finally, what they are whispering, "Come on, you little pussy. I can smell you from here. Come on, come to daddy. I'll find your little sweet pussy. Don't be afraid. Come here." Patient later died. Shortly after, newspaper posted that famous pedophile died in prison. Shit's fucked up. Russian orphan adopted by American mother. Kid was not physically touched or held for the first 6 months of his life. He grew up totally fucked up because of this. Molested his sister, screamed at his mother on the regular, dad was not in the picture, total bully and menace at school. He was like 17 when he came in for services at my agency. Not a mental health professional, but I lived with a lot of mentally ill people for like a month when CPS took me away from my parents. This might not be as bad as some of the stories here, but I still get mad whenever I think about it. I had a roommate who was 11 and had been there for a few months already. She was really kind and very mature for her age. We got kind of close, and she told me that her mother used to leave her alone for days, and she never knew if or when she would come back. She got so desperate she resorted to self-harm to get her mother to care, and she ended up slicing her wrists and putting ink in the wounds, hoping that her mother would care if she was about to die. But her mom didn't care, didn't even come back and notice it. She had to ask her neighbors for help so she wouldn't die. Poor girl never got visits or calls either. I'm genuinely wondering if she's better now, but they didn't let us keep in touch. I have a friend who contacts me regularly late at night from his healthcare position. He has the unenviable task of being a live-in nurse for a house of 4 mental patients. There are no locks on the doors, and all 4 of the men he has to stay with and care for have previously presented extremely violent tendencies. Last time he contacted me, he told me that one of the men had tried to commit suicide by jumping out of a window, only to break his leg. And then at 5 o'clock the next morning, one other tried to stab him with a broken spoon. I don't know if any amount of money could make me want to do that job. Imagine the constant stress. Many years ago, I met a kindergartner whose parents had brought him to the psych ER I worked in at the time. His teacher had called them because the child seemed to be responding to internal stimuli, so they came right to us that evening. This beautiful child with dark smudges under his eyes from not sleeping told me that the voices were telling him to cut his ears and nose off with his little safety scissors. He earnestly told me that his teacher had told class that we only cut paper with our scissors, and that's what he used to try and keep the voice at bay. I staffed the case with the doc on call, and of course, the kid was to be admitted. Meanwhile, some jackass pulled the fire alarm. I go outside to talk to the parents, who are smiling and watching their little boy exploring the fire engine with a couple of firefighters. I knew that this was going to be the very last moment of their before. I cried like a baby over that one. It wasn't super obvious at first, but after looking into her records, it became clear. So this happened on my psychiatry rotation in medical school. Not currently in a psychiatry residency though, although I find it interesting. There was a patient at an inpatient psychiatric facility for suicidal ideation. She constantly insisted that she had a mass on her breasts and demanded to be physically examined only by male doctors. When the psychiatrist I was rotating under declined to perform a physical exam, she asked me to do it during my daily patient interview. I also declined physical exam, but had a bit of a hunch to check her medical records. It turned out she had an ultrasound done a week before that found only normal breast tissue without masses. However, apparently, this lady had frequented many doctors' offices with various complaints of an unspecific nature, and would usually focus on breast or vaginal complaints when she visited male physicians' offices. We diagnosed her with Factitious disorder, formerly known as Munchausen syndrome, and histrionic personality disorder. It seems her goal was mostly attention from medical professionals. She had lots of issues, but we also had to be careful to make sure she wasn't fishing for a lawsuit. Patients like her are why doctors document everything meticulously. So, the patient wouldn't admit to making things up all the time. According to the psychiatrist I was working with, she didn't actually believe any of her health problems exist, and her primary goal was the attention from medical professionals. If she actually believed she was sick, we would have diagnosed her with illness anxiety disorder, commonly known as hypochondria or somatic symptom disorder, depending on whether her symptoms were real, but her reaction was out of proportion to them. Patient was born addicted on methamphetamine and taken home to a house which was also produced for profit. After growing up and later becoming addicted, the patient basically had no social skills or short-term memory due to chronic meth affliction. Scans looked a lot like several traumatic brain injuries. Because they were so developmentally behind, they were in and out of jail, and when they were released back into the public, they would end up in a psych crisis hold. Patient was incredibly violent due to lacking emotional regulation, frequently had auditory and visual hallucinations, didn't know how to eat or bathe properly, couldn't speak an identifiable language, and couldn't otherwise communicate or understand needs, etc. It was a very sad case file to read through.